Good morning, this is the Doughboys Daily News Show. We are here to keep you up to date on all World War I news.
Many people have their own speculations on how the war started, but we have compiled the opinions of many of Americans' finest minds and have put together our own opinion.
Experts say the long-term reasons for this war can be summed up by the acronym MAIN, or MAIN. The M stands for militarism, the development of armed forces and their use as a tool of diplomacy. The A stands for the alliance system. Although it was a good defensive and offensive tactic, the alliance system was responsible for pulling many European nations into the war. The I stands for imperialism. Many nations controlled territories all over the world. This resulted in tension between world powers such as Germany and Britain. The N stands for nationalism. Nationalism led to competitive rivalries among nations and between cultures.
Here is how the spark of war was lit. As tensions between nations came to a high, several key events ignited the flame of war. One such event was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. This caused Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia, a war that was expected to be short due to the Austria-Hungary's military power. Because of the alliances between European nations such as Germany, Russia, France, and Britain were forced into joining the war.
Before the war began, each nation drew up their battle plans. Germany came up with the von Schlieffen Plan. This called for one German army to fight the Russians and another German army to push through Belgium and onto Paris, France. Once they had captured France's capital, Germany would defeat the Russian army that they had been fighting. However, the French fought off the Germans' attack, and the two armies dug long trenches. These trenches resulted in a massive amount of casualties with little exchange in land. Also, poor conditions in the trenches resulted in many of the soldiers getting diseases and suffering from malnutrition.
America tried to stay out of the war, but two events forced them to take action in Europe. The first event happened on May 7, 1915. A German U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania off the southern coast of Ireland. Of the 1,198 persons lost, 128 were Americans. The second event was the Zimmerman Note. This was an intercepted German telegram that asked Mexico to declare war on the United States in return for American land. As a result of these two events, the United States had no choice but to join the war against Germany. Although they declared war, the United States weren't ready for it. First, they needed an army. The government enacted the Selective Service Act. Through this act, 3 million men were called to fight for their country. America was in wartime. This was when we started to ration foods such as meat. Factories started producing materials for the war effort instead of for the consumer. These materials were used to develop and build new weapons to be used on the battlefield. The two most innovative weapons were the tank and the airplane. These two machines proved useful when spying or mowing down enemies. The American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing, was one of the first American forces on the battlefield. These American forces were nicknamed Doughboys because of the white belts they wore, which they cleaned with pipe clay or dough. These American forces were shocked by the unexpected horrors of the battlefield. Many American heroes were formed at this time. Two of the most famous are Eddie Richtenbacher and Alvin York. Eddie was an ace fighter pilot. After engaging in 134 air battles and downing 26 enemy aircraft, Richtenbacher won fame as the Allied pilot with the most victories. Although he was a conscientious objector, Alvin, armed with a rifle and a revolver, killed 25 Germans and, with 6 other doughboys, captured 132 prisoners.
While the soldiers were on the front fighting the war, Americans at home were doing what they could to support their troops. The entire economy had to be refocused on the war effort. Things shifted from producing customer goods to producing war supplies. This shift proved complicated for private businesses, so large businesses and government collaborated in the war effort. The War Industries Board was an agency created to regulate mass production during the war. Under this agency, industrial production in the United States increased by about 20%. For the most part, salaries for the individual worker rose. In many blue-collar jobs, salaries were raised as much as 20%. However, increasing food prices and housing costs undercut household incomes. Food administration was a way for Americans to ration. 1 week a day would be named meatless, another sweetless, 2 days wheatless, and 2 other days porkless. The United States spent about $35.5 billion on the war effort. During the war, citizens were encouraged to buy war bonds. The U.S. government called them Liberty bonds. This is where a person can give money to the war effort. After the war, the government would pay this money back with interest. A progressive income tax was put on many products. This taxed high incomes at a higher rate than low incomes. The Committee on Public Information was formed to use propaganda to increase support for the war. Propaganda showed nationalism at home. This coaxed Americans to do their part for the war. During the years of World War I, immigrants were mistreated. The most bitter attacks were directed against the nearly 2 million Americans who had been born in Germany, but other foreign-born persons and Americans of German descent suffered as well. Many Americans with German names lost their jobs. Orchestras refused to play the music of Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Some towns with German names changed them. Schools stopped teaching the German language, and librarians removed books by German authors from the shelves. Opinions over African American involvement in the war were split. However, despite the inequality at the time, African Americans backed the war. Because of the mistreatment of European immigrants, the amount of immigration into the United States greatly decreased. As a result, many jobs opened up in the northern half of the country. These caused the Great Migration. This was when the large population of African Americans from the South moved north in order to get jobs and to escape the discrimination of the South. Between 1910 and 1930, hundreds of thousands of African Americans migrated to such cities as Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. Many men left for Europe to fight, leaving their families and their jobs behind. As a result, women took up the jobs of their husbands. They became railroad workers, cooks, and dock workers. Many women worked as volunteers, serving at Red Cross facilities and as nurses during the war. Women were taking up the roles of men and they were doing just fine. President Wilson said, "The services of women during this supreme crisis have been the most signal usefulness and distinction. It is high time that part of our debt should be acknowledged." Attention to civil rights for women greatly increased, and women were soon given the right to vote in 1920.
There were many immediate effects of World War I that the countries who were involved had to deal with. World War I was the bloodiest war in history up to that time. Deaths numbered about 22 million, more than half of them civilians. The United States lost 48,000 men in battle, with another 62,000 dying of disease. More than 200,000 Americans were wounded. The treaty barred Germany from maintaining an army. It also required Germany to return the region of Alsace-Lorraine to France and to pay reparations or war damages amounting to $33 billion to the Allies. Social change was on its way. Jane Addams was active in the peace movement. Addams helped found the Women's Peace Party in 1915 and remained a pacifist even after the United States entered the war. The Treaty of Versailles established 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and shifted the boundaries of other nations. It carved 5 areas out of the Ottoman Empire and gave them to France and Great Britain as mandates or temporary colonies. These 2 allies were to administer their respective mandates until the areas were ready for self-rule and then independence. There were many long-term effects of World War I. These included the breakup empire, U.S. policy of isolationism, United States emergence as a global economic giant, the rise of a militant and extremist parties in Europe, and the eruption of World War II. It broke up the Austria-Hungary Empire, the German Empire, and at last the British Empire was beginning to fail. The United States also eventually isolated themselves away from the rest of the countries so that they would never have to deal with another World War again. This was originally Wilson's idea in the 14 points. The last 8 points dealt with boundary changes. Wilson based these provisions on the principle of self-determination along historically established lines of nationality. In other words, groups that claim distinct ethnic identities were to form their own nation-states or decide for themselves to what nations they would belong. 2 decades after the end of the Great War, Adolf Hitler's desire for vengeance would plunge the world into an even greater war, in which the United States would play a leading role. Thank you for listening.
And now a shout out to all of our sponsorships who made this show possible. To the U.S. Navy, thanks for being in the water and being there for us. From McDonald's, proud sponsor of this news show. Help control the pet population. Get your pets spayed and neutered. Good night, everybody.